look, Dennis was a professor at the University of Amsterdam for a very long time. He helped establish the, I guess, now famous Amsterdam School of Communication Research, right? In our field, the #1 ranked school in the world. And when that school was founded, the year it was founded, Dennis went into retirement, which was in 1997. That's also the year I started my PhD at ASCOR, at the Amsterdam School. So I was in the first group of 6 PhD students at the time. And so I got to know Dennis that year and worked with him. And then, you know, as PhD students go, you all know the drill. You get to teach your own classes as well, or teach sections of classes. And I got to teach the first year Introduction to Media Mass Comm course in Amsterdam using Dennis's book, a much earlier edition. And I didn't understand anything. I mean, I was a working journalist before I became a PhD student. And before that, I studied history in Africa. So media and mass comm theory and media studies was, for me, was gobbledygook. It was like statistics. It just sort of seemed to make sense, but when I started thinking about it, it didn't. And then Dennis wasn't helping. I mean, I was reading his book and I was like, yeah, I get this English, but I'm not quite sure what he's saying. And I had to teach it. And of course, that's the best way to understand anything, right? To teach it. And so I started teaching it, and then I realized this is so much fun because he just, the only thing he does is opens doors, right? He doesn't explain what things are. He offers definitions, but then says, well, but things can be different in the real world. And, you know, this is just one way of looking at it. Here's 2,512 other ways of looking at it. So it's like for an undergraduate student looking for help, Dennis is like perhaps the wrong person, or he's the exact right person in the sense that, you know, he's amenable to any kind of interpretation. And for those of us who knew him and would meet him at conferences, he would always, at big academic conferences, sit in a corner somewhere. And then you would walk up to him, even if you didn't know him. And he was like, hey, great to meet you, sit down, and you would talk. And he would have, you know, information about just about anything. But he was primarily interested in what you were working on and just say, oh, that sounds fabulous. I wish you so much luck. And off you go, right? And was just really warm and friendly and kind and just open. And that was, of course, when I started teaching his work, that was my invitation into the field. It's like anything goes, right? This is a field of opportunity and possibility rather than sort of a field where you have to learn these 25 theories or theorists and then you're in, right? As you can see in a lot more established disciplines. So that was always my memory of Dennis, his work and teaching with his work. And then I finished my PhD and then wandered around the United States for about 10 years and ended up in LA and then later on in Indiana at Indiana University. And, noticing that nobody wanted to teach the large, big undergraduate introduction to media courses. And I thought, hey, I used to do this in Amsterdam. That was fun. So I did it again, but, I didn't prescribe McQuail as a reading, but I basically built my class around his work, just updated for sort of the 21st century. And I kept doing that. And then 6 years ago, I came back to Amsterdam to direct the journalism program here. And I'm the director of graduate studies now at the Department of Media Studies. That's sort of the humanities version of ASCOR, if you will. And there it was, the first year undergraduate course, and people were running from it as it was a building on fire. And of course, I was running towards it, like, this is going to be fun. And now the course is called Living Information. I don't know who came up with that, but it's still Dennis, but in a new jacket. The bottom line is, and what I'm trying to tell you is that what always inspired me to be a media scholar is, for me, it was triggered by the personality and the approach that Dennis has to our fields, which is a sense of genuine joy and wonder at all the fabulous things people are doing, without wanting to privilege one perspective over the other, without saying social scientific approaches are better than humanities inspired approaches, without saying quantitative over qualitative, without saying anything really. And perhaps it's because he, of course, originally wasn't a media mass comm scholar. In fact, you could argue that the whole discipline of media mass comm was in part founded because of Dennis, right? He wrote the very first sort of handbook of media mass comm theory when it was still called the Sociology of Media and Mass Communication. And this was in the 70s, in the 60s, right? So it's an amazing sort of history really that he was a part of. And I won't say founding father because that ignores the founding mothers in our field, but it's very much an important figure, of course. So here we are. It was, I'm not quite sure what year it was. I write about it in the introduction to the book. Dennis and I were at a conference in Italy, and we were having coffee in the morning somewhere lovely. And I was telling him, so what's happening to the new edition of the book? And he told me, yeah, I'm done with it, right? I'm too old for, he didn't use the kind of words, but let me just, he said, I'm too old for this shit. It was, and he was laughing and he said, yeah. And I don't know, it just, that kind of hurt. It just felt like bad. I mean, he has such a long tradition, such a history, such a founding role in our discipline, in our field. And I remember all the fun I had teaching with his work and his book. And sort of that felt like the closing of a really important chapter in both my personal life as well as the life of our discipline. And anyways, some time passed and I got to, at some point, talk at a conference with Mila Steele, who at that time was a commissioning editor at Sage, at a conference. And Mila and I are old friends, and we were at a bar, as you do at a conference, and having a couple of drinks. And at some point I said, I really think that you should continue the McQuail books, but under his name. And you should get a ghostwriter or something like that. And he said, yeah, we've gotten some proposals to continue it, but none of it feels right. And well, Dennis has kind of mentioned your name. And I was like, what, wait, what? And I thought this was a typical, like, a commissioning editor sort of buttering you up, right? With drinks at the bar and somebody mentioned your name, good for the ego. But that sort of rekindled my feelings when Dennis and I were chatting in Italy, and I felt like, yeah, I would actually really, really want to do this. I not under my name, but on, make a new edition of McQuail's Media Mass Communication Theory, and as a sort of homage to him, and to preserve sort of his legacy. And I wrote a proposal and I pitched it and it was approved. And then I got a call from Dennis who said, I told Sage that the only person who can do it is you, which was incredibly generous and friendly, but that's who he is, right? And then I had to do it. Now, this was, I think, about 8 years ago. And then life happened. And, I went from Indiana back to Amsterdam. I wrote 3 other books, because that's what you do. And then I realized, and then we all got the horrible news of Dennis passing away, right? And I met Dennis over the years. He would come to Amsterdam once or twice a year, and we would have breakfast and sort of hang out. And he would ask me, so how is the work on the book going? And I would go like, yeah, all right, reading. And which was true, but it just felt too intimidating to get started. But then we got the news of his passing, and I saw all of his old academic friends at his funeral in England, and like Peter Golding and Carla Nordenstreng, and they all came up to me and said, like, so you're doing the new edition, right? That's so great. And I was like, oh, shit, I have to get to work. This is serious. This isn't just sort of some touchy-feely kind of thing that I wanted to do, and that seemed like a good idea at the time. This is real. And so that's when I got started in earnest. I was scared to start a project like this. I mean, what do I know about all these different disciplines and traditions and theories? And I can't read all the books that Dennis has read. I mean, I would be, 80 and still reading. I was a bit overwhelmed. I mean, how do you ever do this? But it also speaks to something that I've learned in my career that I always found really helpful, is that, and you hear athletes say this as well, it's like whatever you plan to do next should feel just a bit too hard to do. Right? So whatever you do next, don't do another version of what you just did before. If you do another research project, if you're going to write another paper, don't write another version of what you already done. Don't submit it to the kind of journals that you generally get accepted by. Go somewhere else. But that somewhere else should be just a little bit harder, just a little bit more, just seemed a little bit more out of reach. And just do it. And generally speaking, it'll work. It will work out one way or another. It will be fine. Even if you fail, right? That's all right too. You can still go back to where you came from. And that's how I ultimately got started with this. I just started, I opened the Word document that Dennis sent to me and started on page 1. And then had that same feeling again as when I started my PhD. It's like, I don't get it. So and of course I had done my homework. Over the years, I collected endless amounts of research papers and books and ordered them and organized them. So I knew what should go in what chapter. I knew which chapters I wanted to get rid of and what chapters to add. But I just, to get going, writing the first word was the hardest part. But once that happened, it was actually relatively smooth sailing. It was hard work. I mean, it took me the writing of the whole, because I rewrote the entire thing. Took me about 8 months. And maybe in conclusion, before I want to open it up for some discussion, and because you have got better things to do than listening to me, but I think I learned a couple of things in the process of this book and of doing this book. One thing is that I got a newfound respect for the way Dennis thought. I mean, what I always found so confusing about the book is that you start reading and then you kind of get lost. It feels like you're in a sea and you're sort of drowning and nobody's offering you a lifeline. It's just, he just throws more and more waves at you, waves of literature and references. And that's very much true. But if you work on it linearly and really read it from page to page to page, right? Like, he was old school. I mean, he started writing in the 60s, right? He didn't write the way we write now, which is almost non-linearly. We expect people to drop down like from a helicopter in the middle of a book, then jump back 50 pages and then jump right until the end. And that's kind of how we write today as well, in chunks. And he doesn't do that. This is really a flowing narrative. And his narrative goes in concentric circles. And every chapter draws the circle closer. That's how he wrote. And that's why chapters in the beginning of his book seem like endless, like 60 pages of media and society. I mean, damn. Can't you just say, yeah, media are really important for society and vice versa? Next chapter, right? But it's this. But then the chapters get shorter and more focused. But he's basically constantly talking about the same things, but in concentric circles. That's how he works, and that's how he worked. And that was a real eye opener for me, and a real inspiring. Instead of, okay, so what does he want us to know? And so that was a major insight that really helped me as I was going along, and that's why the book eventually became relatively easy to write. And secondly, look, Dennis was a man of his time, which meant that, unfortunately, the vast majority of every argument and reference he made was to other white guys, right? And that's not a critique. I mean, that it's a sign of the times. Nobody can come up with all the new literature out there. But I had to obviously do something about it. And not just because I know all the amazing authors out there that happened not to be white guys like me, but also just to make this clear that, you know, we're living in a different world, and the vast majority of the insights in our field today aren't from those kind of gender or race, but also not that part of the world, the global north, right? It's clear that our field is now primarily shaped and influenced by insights from Asia, from Latin America, from sub-Saharan Africa, and all kinds of other places that are now booming in really interesting and fascinating research that doesn't necessarily replicate what we've been doing for the last 50 or 60 years or so. And it's really inspiring and important. So I started to sort of slowly but surely add that to every argument. Not always. Some historical arguments are left intact, but basically all the new stuff is, I would challenge you to find a white guy. there's a couple, but not that many. And it's not because I'm trying to be politically correct or something like that, or, you know, it's just simply that's a reflection of how the field looks today. So that was a step I took. Something, I mean, hey, I'm a co-author now, so that allows me to put Easter eggs in the book, right? To put my stamp on the book. For me, that's and as some of you may know, you know, my original research was always on the production part of the media taxonomy of production, content, reception. So I've paid more attention to media work and media production and media management and how media industries work on a global scale. Also because in my experience, the vast majority of students who have to work with stuff like this are in classes like this because they want to work in the media, especially on an undergraduate level. And in the end, I tried to rewrite the entire section on media effects theories. And the reason for that was primarily because I wanted this book not to be a social science handbook. And of course, our friends in social science talk about media effects, and our friends in media and cultural studies talk about media impact or media influence, or mediatization or media saturate. They have way more terms for pretty much the same phenomenon. And I wanted to integrate those two perspectives without privileging either or, and without setting them side by side. So this is not a book where I say, well, the social science say this, and then the humanities people say that. No, it's completely integrated without listing either or. And that was very deliberate, because in our field, all the big guns, the Sonja Livingstons of this world, the Claes de Vreeses of this world, the Terry Flues of this world, like the biggest names in our field, have all in the last couple of years been advocating that in order for our field to move forward, it needs to embrace more deliberately, you know, triangulation, mixed method approaches, integrated perspectives. And that's a beautiful sentiment. But who's actually doing this? And for those who are doing this, how many of those are actually acknowledging how bloody damn hard that is? To really combine methods, to be well-versed in multiple methods, or to get a team together from people from different disciplinary backgrounds that are still high-fiving halfway through the project. That's tough. That's really tough. And so I wanted to see if I could make it work. And this was based on a privileged position that I have, because I never studied either the social science part of media and mass communication or the humanities part. Like I said, I was a journalist. I interviewed bands. And I was a historian, right? My graduate degree was in African history. So I had no bone to pick, right? I had no camp to defend or invade. I was just, for me, everything was cool. I mean, as a historian, you know, I'm into hermeneutics. Everything is cool. Everything is data. So, and of course, I'm a professor now in the humanities department, but I got my PhD in the social science department at the same university. So it's I don't know what I am. I still teach exactly the same things. I don't know, somebody can maybe at some point explain to me what I'm doing. But so for me, it always made sense to just to treat everything like a bunch of balls that a juggler would keep up in the air. It's like something to play with. So I guess that's a third element, this integrated perspective. And as a final comment, when I wrote the epilogue of the book, I was thinking like, so what is the point really, right? What is the overall message that I've picked up from this, or that that could be, could be taken away? In the book I call it, what's the grand narrative of the field of media and mass communication? And I do feel that the grand narrative, and I'm very much influenced by the kind of social theory that I really like, which is the work of sort of the theorists of late or second or liquid modernity, like the work of Giddens and Bauman and Beck and those kind of thinkers. But that the grand narrative is that most of what we know about media mass communication and how it works is based on a set of assumptions that have in common that these categories are stable, right? That there's a category called media production that happens in movie studios and newsrooms and so on, and ad agencies or game development studios. That there's a category of content, right? That consists of a film or a piece of music or a book or a magazine or those kind of things. And that there's a category of audiences or reception or publics or whatever you want to call it, where people, go out and see a film or buy a book and then read it or watch it and talk about it and give meaning to it. And that these three categories all have their own sort of characteristics in terms of what makes them work and how we can study them. They have their own range of methods, that they have certain conventions, like for example, with content, we talk about content in terms of genres and those kind of things. And that enables us to sort of get a handle on them, get a grip. And what is happening to all of these three things is not that they're gone, it's just that those stable categories, the stable elements that form these categories have begun to shift. If you're want to talk about this in industrial terms, you say they're being disrupted, they're liquefied, they're moving. So yes, there's still media production, but most of that you and I are doing at home, right? When we switch on a computer, we're already making media because every keystroke sends data somewhere that ends up in a database somewhere that benefits someone, right? That's media production right there. And that leaves alone every app we send, every email that we compose, every like or tweet or favorite or vlog or whatever. So yeah, that's all now media production. Acts of consumption have become production. And content, what is content actually? Content is this sort of floating signifier, if you want to be fancy about it. I mean, over 10 years ago, the advertising industry was talking about the premise of liquid media. The notion of media sort of flowing across different channels, adapting themselves to whatever technological or usability parameters would be changing, content being different from one computer to the next, from one smart television to the next, based on the user data that was available at the time. And that kind of content is what we're seeing right now. Every journalist right now will tell you that he or she doesn't make finished stories anymore. They build stories that are constantly changing, and they get new headlines, new edits, new pictures, new adaptations, they do A/B testing. It's like a story is almost never finished. So content has also become this sort of floating liquid thing. And of course, what is media consumption today? Because we are consuming media, but that consumption takes place along all kinds of other things. I mean, back in the day, the industry would value itself on the basis of ratings, right? How many people would subscribe to your newspaper or buy a movie ticket or tune into a television show. That was the currency of the industry. Now that currency still exists, but it has first shifted towards time spent, right? It doesn't matter that a lot of people watch your show, but if they all stop watching after a minute, yeah, well, that's kind of pointless. Okay, let's start measuring how much time people actually spend with, and that's of course a devastating metric that has caused the advertising revenue of the most industries to plummet because most people don't spend much time with anything. But all right, time spent. And what is the major currency today? Engagement. And actually, what is engagement? It's media production, right? So the currency of media consumption has become media production. It's not valuable that somebody watches your TV show. It's only valuable when they also tweet about it, right? The industry would call it second screen engagement, right? So it's for me, it's fascinating that the grand narrative of our field is that the categories that we've made up, production, content, reception, are still there, but they all mean in various instances the same thing. They collapse, they move around, they're like floating, they're in movement, they are, and that is the grand narrative. That is that's what we're studying. We're studying a moving object. And perhaps if you're metaphysically inclined, we've always done that. It's just that now it becomes almost impossible to maintain that there is such a thing as a media text, that there is such a thing as a media audience, that there is such a thing as a media maker. It's all messed up. And I think that's a really exciting idea. What kind of methods belong to studying that? How do you capture that? How can you make an interesting statement about that? So I think that kind of fluid or liquid perspective on the main categories for me is the key challenge to our field. And so when I start work on the next edition, I'll be back 5 years from now. That's where it should start. I think that's the key. So how has our field been able to sort of deal with this fluid, liquid media environment that we're in? And there are already really interesting concepts, concepts like transmedia and convergence culture and co-creation. And I mean, there's so many interesting concepts that are already out there. I mean, the whole shift in our field, both in the humanities and social sciences, towards looking more at embodied or affective notions of media use and production, right? That is, I mean, if you study affect, as the humanities do, or embodied cognition, as the social scientists do, which is the same thing, right? It's just the one expressed in different ways. The moment you start studying that, you embrace the notion that what you're studying is never exactly the same from 1 second to the next, right? Because our bodies are never the same. The way we process emotions is never the same. It is always different. And that's so you have to come up with models, either through multivariate models or conceptual models, to accommodate that kind of transition, that movement, that dynamism. So it's already happening throughout our field. And I think that's a really exciting challenge. That's going to be so much fun to see what comes out of the work that you all are doing, and so many of your friends are doing in so many different departments around the world. I've talked way too much. I'm so sorry, Daniela, but that's kind of what I've been taking away from all of these last couple of years. And yeah, I'm just really excited to be able to talk about it now.
Thank you so much. This was fascinating. So many ideas. And so, I mean, I could see the wheels turning, and you're giving me a lot of challenges and new ideas as well. I really appreciated what you said at the beginning, that the book can feel a little overwhelming. And I can see my students nodding, because it is the first time we read this book. It's like, just like you said, there's so much information, and there's so much, right, language and long sentences and, you know, theories, that I think it's easy to sort of get lost. And that's what I keep telling my students this semester: just give it a chance, give it a try, keep reading, I really appreciated when you said, you know, that later in the book things start to click and, you know, things start to connect and make more sense and more sense. So I guess this is reassurance for the students that things will be okay and don't despair. I think we have a few minutes to maybe some take questions from from the audience. If you guys want to unmute yourselves and jump in and ask a question, that's great. If you prefer to type in the question in the chat, I can be the one reading the question. So think about that, and maybe I'll just ask the first one so we can get that brave volunteer after me. But I kind of, I wanted to ask a question, not so much about theories, but, you know, about the point that you made that we want to include more voices in the book. And this is, of course, you know, a question now I'm gonna get as, you know, journal editor, and that we're wanting to expand, you know, editorial boards, and we're wanting to have, you know, different types of authors and reviewers. So can you just, and, you know, it's a question in the bigger kind of, you know, society too, that we want to be inclusive and diverse, but can you just explain, if you can, in terms of scholarship, why is it important to have that diversity of voices presented in the book?
Well, I think there's a couple of reasons why this is important. I mean, and I think the most important one is to recognize that media mass communication research, especially communication research, existed in Africa and Latin America well before it did in the United States, England, or Western Europe, right? I mean, in the early 1960s, there was a whole scholarship community across Africa on the concept of aura media. It's something I talk about in the new book as well. And aura media is a term that describes all the different forms of communication that were used between communities or tribes across Africa to sustain these communities, to delineate these communities from other communities, to carry on the narrative of a certain community. That, of course, all these communities were almost destroyed, or at least cut up by the British way of putting borders, right? All the borders in Africa were invented by the British. And they would often make arbitrary lines. So the reason why African countries sometimes look like this is because that's what the British did. Like, yeah, that's Africa now, and that's Ghana, and that's Zaire. So let them figure it out who lives where. Now, and so the notion of communities that were torn apart and by colonizers was sustained through all kinds of communication practices that were primarily oral, hence aura media. And that includes dance and folk song and traditions and all that kind of stuff. And so there's a very rich tradition of scholarship making sense of mass communication before, you know, Wilbur Schramm or Dennis McQuail or any of those people ever coined it. And the same in Latin America. There's a concept there called folk communication, which is one word, folk communication, which pretty much describes the same process. They weren't aware of the literature in Africa at the time, but it's the same kind of idea. And it actually, because of Latin American scholarship traditions, has an immediate critical bent to that tradition as well, where they say that folk communication was a way not just to recognize and study sort of more traditional mass communication patterns across Latin American societies, but also very much to celebrate and traditional communication practices against the media and communication signals and messages that came from the West, and especially from the United States. So it was almost like a communication scholarship as a protest movement. And so we have a lot to learn. I guess that's what I'm saying. We have a lot to learn. And our way of making sense, I mean, the fact that for the longest time, our field was influenced by the sender message receiver model, which in a lot of Asian scholarship, African and Latin American scholarship, makes no sense whatsoever, right? It's just like, what? That's not how communication works. That's not, and we now know that as well, of course, but there's still people who think that way. There's still textbooks that actually have that bloody model in there. So, so the number one reason is we got a lot to learn. And not because these people don't talk the same language that we do or whatever, or they have a different skin color or a different gender. No, we just have a lot to learn. There's a world of scholarship out there that has been untapped, in part because it wasn't in English, right? That was a reason for it. But we see now that, like what happened in Germany in the 1990s is now happening across Latin America and Asia, is that more and more scholars start publishing in English, or there's more endeavors by Western publishers to have important work from these parts of the world translated. There's more international exchange at conferences, especially the IMCR, but also ICA. So there's that, right? There's a field opening to us, which I think is fabulous. So there's that. I think another reason is simply has to do with examples, both for scholars like role models, but also a simple empirical examples, like what are the kind of things that we can study. Should we still have a study on how did the New York Times cover COVID between March and December 2020? Blech. No, who cares? The New York Times. Really, it's not very important. Maybe we should study how community media in certain parts of the US and Austria and Venezuela and in the Aboriginal communities in Australia, how they did it, how local radio, for example, covered it. Now, that's a study I would love to see, and that I would include in the new handbook, because that's a study that's going to teach us something, right? Something that we didn't already know, something that we didn't already have a pretty, ironclad hypothesis for. And I think that's the real challenge for our field. I mean, if we all say to each other, like all these hotshots in our field are saying, like we need mixed methods and integrated approaches and new ways of tackling the challenges of the 21st century, whew, great, then let's actually do that, right? And for that, we need to open up new boxes, right? We need to kick down new book depositories. And so that's another very good reason to de-Westernize or to be more inclusive in our reading and in our citing practices. And beyond exactly what you're saying, but for me, that's the last argument, is that, yeah, there's too many white people and too many guys in our field that are constantly being cited and put in handbooks and assigned to classes. And that's just not okay, no matter how smart that work perhaps is.